Now we'll move on to the roundtable panel discussion, and I'm going to introduce the moderator of that discussion. The moderator is Michael Nyberg, who is the inaugural chair of War Studies in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the United States Army War College. His public work specializes on the First and Second World War, notably the American and French experiences. His books include Dance of the Furies, Europe in the Outbreak of World War I, named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the 5 best works written about the war, The Blood of Free Men, Potsdam, The End of World War II in the Remaking of Europe, and most recently, The Path to War, How the First World War Created Modern America. Professor Nyberg?
Well, thank you, everybody. It's a great honor to be here. I come from a family of high school teachers, so I know what you do. I respect what you do. I have 2 high school students, so I really respect what you do. And I'm happy to be here focusing this panel on teaching. Last year, I guess it was, my 10th grader came home with a homework assignment that had a question about World War I, and she said, "Dad, I'm not sure. Is it A, B, C, or D?" And I said to her, "Well, none of them is right, but your teacher wants C, so circle that and go with it." And it was a reminder to me of how difficult this subject is to teach. And I don't know how much time you have to teach it, but when I designed world history curricula, when I was designing those curricula, I gave myself about 12 minutes to teach the First World War. And I've come to the conclusion that there is a 1-semester way to teach this war, and there's about a 12-minute way to teach this war, and there's not much in between. Now, the 1-semester way allows historians to dig in and teachers to dig into the complexity of this war, but you rarely have that much time. The problem with the 15 or 12-minute version is that it boils down the causes of the First World War and American entry into the war to simple answers like the sinking of the Lusitania, which John very rightly points out had very little connection to American entry into the First World War. It, of course, happened in 1915, not 1917. It also produces some quite simple stereotypes like the alleged influence of American industrialists and financiers, which John also very nicely dismantled, anxious to protect their own investments. So we have a paradox here, we have a dilemma. On the one hand, this is an extraordinarily difficult thing to teach. And on the other hand, as Senator Birmingham noted earlier, it is the event that created and formed our world. It is what George Kennan called the 20th century's seminal catastrophe. So, how to teach something that is at the same time critical to getting our students to understand the world that they live in today, and at the same time so limited in the amount of resources that we devote to it. Now, I wish I had an easy answer to give you here, and I know our panelists will have some answers here as well. But I want to focus a little bit on challenges, a little bit more, and then talk a little bit about maybe some observations about some things we might think about, even if I can't give you a very good answer. The first challenge, as has been noted here before, Professor Kennedy mentioned, is that Americans generally lack a lot of knowledge on the First World War. I've taught entire courses on World War I and entire courses on World War II, and the experience is very, very different. When I teach World War I classes, I start from a completely blank slate. I have to assume that my students don't know anything. They may not know that World War I preceded World War II. That's actually true. I gave that on a pop quiz one time. I asked students to put in chronological order World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. That's actually a true statement. When I taught the Second World War, however, it is not that students don't know anything, it is that what they know is often wrong, because what they've learned from Hollywood. So whereas from World War I start from a blank slate, World War II I feel like I have to break a bone and then reset it. They're both teaching challenges, but in very different ways. Second, there is an historiographic challenge, as you've heard Professor Kennedy and Professor Cooper talk about a little bit, and I'm sure our panelists will talk a little bit, or reference a little bit as well. How to balance out the various histories of this war. There is the military history of the war, there is the political history of the war, there is the social history of the war, and there is the cultural history of the war. If you're limited in time to study, which is the most important? What do our students really need to know, and why? And that, of course, will vary with students and will vary with teachers. Third, the tension between national history and international history. If the centennial events of the First World War have convinced me of anything, it's that teaching national history of an event as global as the First World War makes no sense whatsoever. But again, if you're short on time, how do you connect the American experience to the international experience, especially if it is an American history course that you're teaching? Now again, I wish I had answers to these questions. I don't think, however, that we've gotten the balance between all of these various dilemmas right, and that might be okay. It is a complicated enough topic, it is an interesting enough topic to allow for a lot of variation and to allow talented teachers like yourselves to take this discussion in the way that you want to take it. So I want to put 3 ideas in your head as you begin to think about how you're going to teach the First World War to your students, and then I want to leave as much time as I can to our panelists. First, we have to keep the United States experience in this international dimension. And as Professor Kennedy noted, this is a time when the United States is increasing its footprint in the world, whether it wanted to do so or not. That, it seems to me, has got to be a part of that story. And the ways in which Americans are wrestling with that dilemma, the ways in which Americans are disagreeing with how they feel about that, and the debate between William Jennings Bryan and Theodore Roosevelt is an excellent way to get that point across. It also helps to address the question of how the First World War and talking about the First World War is relevant to the world that we're living in today, because as someone noted in the Q&A, this is exactly the debate that we're having right now. What should America's role in the world be? How should we use our power? Should we do it through international institutions, many of which were World War I creations, if not World War II creations? Or ought we to stay away from those institutions and use American power for our own interests, not just for our good, but for the good of the world? Again, that's a First World War question. Second, it seems to me that we need to make sure that we do not bracket or parenthesis this war. And what I mean by that is that we take the years 1914 to 1918, or the years 1917 to 1918, and put them as a separate kind of category. This is my frustration sometimes with looking at textbooks. There's a separate section called the First World War, which creates this illusion that these years are somehow in a special box, that don't belong to the period that came before and don't belong quite to the period that came after. And that, it seems to me, is a mistake. Third, we need to find ways to explain the significance of the First World War to our students, a discussion that we've already begun to have. To me, it's very easy. My kids are sick and tired of hearing about it. I can trace almost anything back to the First World War, no problem. I can do 3 degrees of separation to anything. They're sick of hearing about it, but it's true. It is the First World War that broke the international order of 1914. It is a world that created not a new order, in my view, but a series of debates about what that new order ought to look like. It's a debate that happened here. It's a debate that happened in Europe. And as Professor Cooper mentioned a couple of times, it is a debate that happened in the Middle East as well, when not only the borders get reshaped, but the institution of the caliphate goes away. And as some of you may know, ISIS is right now in parts of Iraq and Syria quite literally bulldozing over the borders that the Europeans drew for the Middle East in 1916 and 1917. They are doing that to make the symbolic statement that the Europeans had no right to form those borders in the first place, and thereby to create the modern nation states of Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, so on and so on. So let me end with an example that is related to the United States Senate, since this is the beautiful facility that we're in here. A prominent American senator, who I will not name, nor will I name his party, recently tweeted that the problem the United States has with Russia is Vladimir Putin, not the Russian people. Now, I don't know if this particular senator knows, but he was echoing the statement made almost 100 years ago to this hour by President Woodrow Wilson in that Senate chamber, when Wilson said to the assembled members of the U.S. Congress, "We have no quarrel with the German people. We have no feelings towards them but one of sympathy and friendship. It was not upon their impulse that the government acted in entering this war. It was not with their previous knowledge or approval. It was a war determined upon as wars used to be determined upon in the old unhappy days, when people were nowhere consulted by their rulers and wars were provoked and waged in the interests of dynasties or of little groups of ambitious men who were accustomed to use their fellow men as pawns and tools." Now, the old unhappy days, it seems to me, are not gone yet. And for that reason alone, it is critical, it is important, it is essential that we look anew at the First World War and how to teach it. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our 4 panelists. I'm going to give them about 3 to 5 minutes each. I am not afraid to use this gavel to make their introductory remarks. Then I'm going to pose a couple of questions to the group to answer. I'm going to do it from behind, which is a little unusual, but we'll go with it. And then we'll open it up to the floor. So let me call them to the podium, please. It is my pleasure to introduce Kelly Brown, who is a history and social studies teacher at East Hampton Public Schools, which is in Western Massachusetts. Yeah, I'm a Pennsylvanian, so forgive my ignorance of the geography. Andrew Carroll, the founding director of the Center for American War Letters at Chapman University in Anaheim, California. Ed Lengel, the chief historian of the White House Historical Association in Decatur House in Washington, D.C., and Clara Webb, European and World History teacher at the Boston Latin School. So let's go in alphabetical order, if that's okay. So Kelly, the floor is yours.
Okay. Oh. Let's see if I can. I think I'm just going to hold this. I think that might work better. Can everyone hear me okay? Wonderful. So I just want to make a few brief statements. I generally am an American history teacher, and so I want to focus my statement on some skills that I think students can practice in learning about World War I, some themes that I think are very important and push us away from teaching World War I as an isolated incident, and also just the reoccurring theme here of misconceptions that students have. And so I've picked 3 things to talk about. And the first is really about understanding the context of the war. When I first started teaching, as you all know, we're expected to be generalists, and we don't always have the education we need to teach in the depth that we need to. And if you look to some of the US history texts and other things that tell us what to teach, nationalism, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And when you try to propose that to students as a new teacher, no doubt they have confusion. And so I really believe in the fact, a mentor of mine always says, students are the victims of what their teachers don't know. And I believe that. I think it's really important. So I dug pretty deep into learning about World War I, and I think it's very important for students to understand the European context and what is happening in Europe at the time in order to understand World War I. And not only that, but then to understand the 20th century. And so I have this problem of having to teach in 17 minutes the causes of World War I in Europe, which is quite a challenge. I like to start with the Berlin Conference in 1884 and somehow make it to the assassination, including things like Slavic nationalism, the annexation of Bosnia, Russian imperialism in the Balkans, the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the cult of personality, right? Comparing Bismarck with Wilhelm I and Wilhelm II. All of these things are incredibly complex, and I have about 3 of those 17 minutes to teach it. And so that is indeed a challenge, and I did want to just suggest some of the ways that I do approach that. And so I brought with me the 25 laminated cards I have that involve personalities, countries, groups that I think are important for students to have some context of, in which we do sort of an interactive lecture, acting out, a bit of a role play, just to get through the basic causes of the war. And I do think it's incredibly important. The other thing I think that's important, that I learned a lot from Professor Nyberg's book, is just the fact that it is often inappropriately taught that Europe was expecting war, and that a lot of Europeans were not expecting the war. And I think that's really important in teaching about the socialist movement in Europe and how important that was in sort of questioning war and trying to unite workers across Europe. The other piece, of course, is that Ferdinand was not really liked, which would also make it more confusing for students to understand why on earth the country would, the European continent would go to war over this one person. And so that's kind of the first piece. I think context is incredibly important, and my US history students will understand the macro context of American involvement in foreign policy, the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, the Panama Canal, all of these pieces, but they have zero context when I get them for this. And so really trying to help them with that. The second piece that I think is really important, sort of this idea of connecting World War I and World War II. While World War I didn't have as large of an impact as World War II on America in some ways, certainly it's very hard to understand World War II without understanding World War I. And so just a couple of examples of that I work with students are things like the problems associated with World War I guide decisions in World War II, the actions of the big 3, big questions about intervention, democracy, moral dilemma. All of these things are reevaluated after World War I and applied in thinking about World War II. The 14 points, peace without victory, all these things that we teach, self-determination, don't really make sense without understanding the context of what's happening prior to World War I. And I think when we begin to even look at the outcomes of World War II, the war conferences, the League of Nations, the UN, the Marshall Plan, even Nuremberg as a choice in terms of trial versus treaty as a form of punishment, I think is an interesting comparison. And it allows students to use complex thinking, to think about really higher order thought about how these things are similar, different, and how they actually influence each other. And the last thing I just want to say is that despite the fact that we've heard several times that World War I is not a huge experience in many ways for Americans, there are some really important touch points. I think certainly talking about the lost generation, people like Hemingway, who not only wrote, and that's what we talk about, but is incredibly influenced by World War I, ending up in the Spanish Civil War, and his work on trying to influence FDR and through his wife, Martha Gellhorn, and others. The Great Migration is something that I spend a lot of time looking at with students that I think is incredibly important and really instigated by the First World War. Schenck, right? This is the first time we see sort of the rules about speech in war. This is a really important event. It also is the peak of nativism, which comes after this, where we have our quota acts and things like that that are all associated with World War I. And of course, women. And so I think when thinking about how we teach World War I as a touch point and connecting things back, I do think, even though I'm not to the extent a scholar like Professor Nyberg, really, maybe 6 degrees of separation for me, that I can link it back to World War I because it is really impressive and important through U.S. history. So thank you.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is an extraordinary opportunity with just amazing people to talk on what I think is a very important issue. My focus is more on the micro. I focus on the letters that troops write, that politicians write behind the scenes, and so forth. But I do want to address the macro issues as well. For teaching it, just to cut to the chase, the reason I love letters is because you follow the personalities, you follow the individuals. A lot of people don't realize Truman's experience in World War I was a defining moment for him, and he wrote incredible letters. I mean, he was right there on the battlefield. He was almost killed several times. This influenced his views. Of course, Patton, MacArthur, Marshall, all these guys got their real serious training in World War I, and their letters, when they're in the thick of it, are very compelling, and they draw you in, and then you want to learn more about what happened to them afterwards. Donovan is a huge figure. Wild Bill Donovan, who was in World War I, he was in the trenches getting shot at, and then went off and founded the OSS. Really fascinating people to follow, and it makes the war more human, and it makes it more approachable. For someone like myself, I hated history growing up. I was an English major. I didn't get interested in World War I until I found out that there were World War I gas munitions buried under our house in Washington, D.C., and guys in biohazard suits were coming in to clear out because this was one of the most poisonous gases ever created. And I want to get to the importance of the war, because I respectfully want to take a little bit of issue with what Professor Kennedy said of its significance and so forth. In some ways, I think it's the most important war to look into, because it gets to the central question that students should be asking themselves, and we as a society need to ask ourselves as well: when do we use force? And there was no Pearl Harbor-like moment with World War I. I mean, the closest thing was actually the Zimmerman telegram, which we haven't really talked about. But it was very much, and I also sort of take issue with the fact that there were the realists and the Wilsonians and the isolationists. There were people who genuinely felt that Germany was in the wrong. There were thousands of Americans who signed up with the French Foreign Legion, who worked as ambulance drivers, who flew with the Lafayette Escadrille. And you read their letters, and of course there's a romance to it. Of course they have that desire to fight, to prove their manliness, all these things. But there's also a genuine desire to right a wrong. And that they saw what happened to Belgium, and they saw what the Germans were doing to the French and so forth, and they generally felt that this was on principle. And many Americans, in fact, one of the reasons why we didn't get involved was not on principle. It was because you had Germans and Irish Americans who had very vested interests in keeping the country out of the war. The Irish loved to see the British caught up in a huge entanglement, and the Germans didn't really want to go off and fight their cousins and their siblings. So there were a principled group of people who felt, and I would even put TR in this, I think he was a hawk, but I think he wasn't just for using might for its own sake. He thought that the Germans were in the wrong. And how many millions of lives could have been saved if we had gone in earlier? I'm not saying that they would have been. It's a what if. How many millions of lives would have been saved in World War II if we had gone in earlier? How many millions of lives were lost because we went into Vietnam? So these are the questions of when do we use force that I think we as a society really have to address, and this war gives us the perfect opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Hello. I probably don't quite fit on this panel completely because I don't teach U.S. history at all. I teach AP European history and also world history at the high school level. So I do have the luxury of getting into more of the context of World War I in both of my classes, which is nice. But I do sort of, I think Professor Nyberg mentioned, I do like the 2-week version of it in AP Euro, and I do the 3-day version of it in AP World History. So when I told my students I was coming to this panel, they, I'm not exaggerating, broke out into applause. Not because they have any interest in these kind of panels, but they know I'm obsessed with World War I. I have a display, like a World War I display, that it has a plastic version of the helmet that Professor Kennedy was wearing that I got at the National World War I Museum in Kansas City, Missouri, and has like the poem Flanders Field, there's a poppy, there's like all kinds of stuff. So, and they kind of think it's a joke at the beginning of the year. Like, why would you be obsessed with World War I? Because, like Professor Nyberg mentioned, they don't know anything about it. And clearly there are way more interesting wars to be interested in. So I really like that. I like that students know nothing about World War I because it allows me to really see by the end of having learned about the war, I think their understanding of it changes, and it just opens up a lot of questions about war. I think the things that obviously I try to emphasize in my classes, both of them, is emphasizing the global nature of the war. Even in European history, you know, we dive very deeply into the European battles and things like that. But in the recent years, I've done much more to try to look at the use of colonial troops in the war, how the war transformed relationships between Europe and the colonies in Africa and Asia and the Middle East. And I went to Senegal actually in February with a school trip. And right in the middle of Dakar, there's a giant statue of a French soldier with basically his arm around a Senegalese soldier. And so I learned a lot when I was in Senegal about the Senegalese tirailleurs. I can't say that properly, it's French, but the Senegalese troops that fought in colonial wars and also the world wars. So that's something I've really emphasized more in my curriculum in recent years. I look a lot at the 3 degrees of separation thing, looking at the Easter Rising, the Russian Revolution. Even I've discovered the impacts of World War I in China, that there was Chinese labor during World War I for the Allies. The disappointment of the Treaty of Versailles sparked the May 4th movement in China, which was this big kind of student movement for democracy and change, and that led to the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party. So as I've gotten more into it, I've found so many connections to 20th century and 21st century themes. So the global nature of the war is something that I'm very interested in, and that's, you know, kind of, I think, what I will add to the panel. The second thing is just looking at the human side of war. I think students are used to the textbook, dry statistics, maps. It's so hard to understand when you say, you know, 9 million people died. It doesn't mean anything. It's just like too big to think about. And so I think World War I, there's the poetry, I think, is a hugely valuable resource for students in thinking about the emotional impact of war. The photographs, the artwork, you know, in the post-war kind of period, and the disillusionment, and trying to understand trauma. I think that's something students are kind of interested in, this understanding of shell shock. You know, we talk about the fact that soldiers were executed for cowardice during World War I, and very recently, like, the British government has apologized for that. So I think there's a lot to be explored about the experience of soldiers, and I also really put a big emphasis on the home front, you know, as being really critical, and looking at how that affects women and gender. And there's a lot of parallels, I think, between the United States and the experience in Europe in terms of many of those things. So I think kind of the last thing is just, I appreciate that World War I, unlike World War II, I think World War II kind of makes sense to students. Like, okay, it was very costly in terms of lives, but there was a cause. You know, this was against fascism and democracy triumphs. World War I, you come out of it with, like, why was this war fought? And I think that's really what kind of hooks students in the end. There was a senselessness to the war. What people were told and why they enlisted in the war proved to be completely different from what they experienced. And then when they come home, if they came home, how that they process that and how societies process that. So I like that World War I is complicated and it doesn't have easy answers, and so I think there's a lot for students to grapple with. I'll leave it there.
I'm going to echo points made by all of my fellow panelists about how important it is to personalize the war. I, like Professor Nyberg, I come from a family of teachers. I've often worked with teacher institutes and workshops on a variety of subjects, and I know that the time you have is often the determining factor of what you can do. So how many salient points can you get your students to remember, and will they even remember it after they've left? That's obviously a big question. I think the most important aspect to me of being a practicing historian or to study history in any aspect is compassion and is empathy. To try not to objectify and just categorize and pass judgment on the past, but try as much as possible to personally experience it. And if you can try to work in ways to have your students experience the subject personally, I think the more success ultimately you will have. And there are a number of different approaches to that. One of the first concepts, I think, is to remember that there is no one war experience. And that's something that we've had a lot of trouble understanding, particularly when it comes to the First World War. It's so defined by stereotype. It's so defined by convention. We think we know what it was like to be a soldier in World War I. You know, you stumbled through miles of mud and you fell into a trench and you're bombarded by artillery and you're traumatized and you're miserable, and you enter the war filled with idealism and you leave the war crushed and disillusioned. We think that's the World War I experience, and I think for Americans particularly, that's one of the things that turns us off. Because we say, why should I waste my time studying this? It's just an endless tale of squalor and misery. So the war was actually, just like any war, far more complex than that. And just like in any war, each individual brought into that war their own collection of preconceptions. They brought out of that war their own individual experiences and understandings. So if you can keep away as much as possible from preconceptions, lots of soldiers went into that war, fought in the trenches, fought in some of the most intense combat imaginable, and left feeling they did the right thing. And even left feeling it was a positive experience. That the comradeship, the things that they remembered, the friendships in particular that they formed, transcended all human relationships. And that was one of the reasons they had so much trouble readjusting. So I'd say, just in conclusion, personalize the war as much as possible. Poetry, literature, letters, films, there's so much that you can use to try to give them that personal experience.
I want to thank the speakers for keeping to time, though I was hoping to gavel someone, at least Ed. And now we have till about 12:25 for me to pose questions to the panel, and then 10 minutes for you to pose questions to the panel. So I want to start by picking up on something that Senator Birmingham said, which is about Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby, which is a book that I assume all of your students have read or will have some exposure to. And he's absolutely right, that all of the male characters in that book are absolutely defined by what they did in the First World War. On the other hand, I've had conversations with fiction authors who've gotten in touch with me to clear up points in their book, who tell me that they do not see it as their responsibility to get the history right. They see it as their responsibility to tell a story. So my question for you as the panel, how do you treat works of fiction, which can be very illuminating and can touch on other things students are doing in other classes, being aware that it is not the job of a fiction writer to get the history right? So since I see a head bobbing, I'll start here to my left. Yeah, you never acknowledge the question.
That's fine. I'll just say two quick things about fiction. I think on the one hand, students struggle for context to understand things. And so I think at any point we have a touch point for them to say this is some prior knowledge they have, whether it be fully accurate or not. It can sometimes give a starting off point for students. And I think we work very hard in our classroom to think about any source that we approach by evaluating the source, the context, corroborating it with other things. So I think in some ways, while these are works of fiction, particularly the ones from the 20s, are also primary sources that we're looking at, even though they're works of fiction. And so helping students really look at them as part of the historical narrative, I think, is important, and really getting them to practice the skills of not just what's fiction and what isn't fiction, but why is Fitzgerald writing this, or why is Hemingway writing this, and placing it in the context of the time period. So those are two things I like to deal with students when we talk about fiction.
I'd like to add a brief comment that fiction should be juxtaposed with nonfiction in terms of diaries and memoirs and the rest. And one of the things that scholars have found in analyzing fiction produced after the war and the whole concept of disillusionment is that that idea of entering the war naive and leaving the war crushed and disillusioned was something A, created by fiction writers, and B, often created by those who had very little, if any, experience of actual combat at the front. And so if you remember in using that fiction, you have an individual perspective on what the war meant. Where does that perspective come from? Does it come from actual experience, or does it come from a societal understanding of trying to make sense of the war? Did it define how people thought? Were there other people who had different experiences? I had to, by the time I got to graduate school, I had to read All Quiet on the Western Front 3 times because everybody assigned All Quiet on the Western Front. Well, Erich Maria Remarque had maybe 1 to 2 months of experience in the trenches. He never saw real combat. And there were others, many other authors, who experienced things very differently. So always to keep that balance of perspective.
What he said. Ready for the next question? All right. So in teaching military history classes, what I have found is that students like the military stuff. They like the stories of the Lost Battalion, Harlem Hellfighters, George Patton, et cetera, et cetera. But I also think that sometimes it's the least important thing for me to teach them. So what is the balance that you strike in teaching the war parts of this to your students? And is it important to give the students what they want? Or is it more important to give the students what you think they need?
I think my thinking has evolved a little bit on this. I am not a military historian, and I actually wish I could take a class called military history for teachers or for like non-military people, because I think I don't focus a lot on with World War I, we sort of do the overview of the war. We definitely talk about how the war breaks out and, the emergent trench warfare, big topic. But like the battles, we kind of sort of, give the overview. And I don't talk a lot about generals and military leaders. I do think that some students are into that. Not all students are into it. So I think it's sort of like balancing the two. But I do think there is something to be said about war strategy and kind of the impact of technology in World War I. And also, when I've emphasized more the home front, the importance of supplies in World War I and how that was a decisive factor in the winning of the war. And that gets into things about like women's employment and things like that. So I actually think it's something I would like to incorporate a little bit more into my teaching, not as much maybe the focus on the personalities of generals, but just how, like, as a layer of understanding the war through military history.
I just want to throw in a word because you mentioned the generals, and I just finished doing research on General Pershing. And Pershing's a fascinating character because there's streets and squares named him all across the country, but he's been sort of forgotten. And when I start talking to students about Pershing, I can see their eyes start to roll, and I say, keep in mind this one fact about him. August 27th, 1915, he got a phone call from a reporter, and he said, I need to get a quote from the general about the fire at the Presidio. Pershing had picked up his own phone. It wasn't his aide. So he said to the reporter, what fire? And the reporter said, sir, you haven't heard this news. He said, no, I haven't. What happened? I'm sorry to want to tell you this, but your wife and your 3 daughters were just killed in a house fire in San Francisco. And your little boy, Warren, was pulled out alive. He was unconscious, but he'll survive. And Pershing took that with him to France. And when I tell students that story, I actually have original letters by Pershing in his handwriting where he talks about, 3 months after the fire, he had not told Warren that his sisters and his mother were dead. He said they were vacationing in Wyoming with the in-laws. He was so distraught about this. And just that story, we talk about empathy and compassion. You know, he's known as this kind of steely-eyed, tough, humorless, almost more machine than man, but he was carrying that loss with him throughout the war. And it shaped much of his character and his judgment. And I just think that it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive of, and I'm sure you agree with this, that we can tell the great stories and we can tell the history, but the more we are drawn into it, the more we're going to want to learn about it. And what like Ken Burns' Civil War documentary did so well was draw Americans into a story. And that one Sullivan Blue Letter was transformative. And it made people want to learn more about it on their own. So you all only have 17 minutes or whatever it is, to teach it. But if their interest is generated, then they're going to want to learn more on their own.
I'll just say one quick thing, which is I think a few things about teaching military strategy, but also just military experience. Just to reiterate what some people have said, I think teaching the experience of soldiers and some of the things that they had to face through letters and through diaries and first-hand experiences, I think is really incredibly important. Something else that just strikes me when I look at footage from World War I is how soldiers were sent out ill-prepared and what that meant, when they were fighting the first part of the war without helmets, when they were sent off really in large numbers, and the amount of death that was happening during the war, sort of juxtaposed with some of this footage of people like George V and Tsar Nicholas together sort of laughing and talking, and not that they weren't taking the war seriously, but just this constant question I have in my mind, which is the people who are fighting versus the people making decisions, and helping students sort of think about war strategy and the impact of war on soldiers. And to me, that's an important thing for them to think about. Also, just Pershing's choice about not having the soldiers fight in the amalgamated units, except for that he did let some of the segregated units fight, which I think is also an interesting point, which is he protects the American soldiers to an extent by having them fight separately, but he does allow some of the African-American units to fight, and they do fight with some of the amalgamated troops from places like Senegal. And a question in my head, which I can't corroborate, but I ask my students is, that happens in World War II, and it really gets pieces of the civil rights movement moving, and it makes me think that is also expanding the conversation and the experience of these soldiers when they're in World War I. And so I think it's important, but I just want to reiterate what Clara says, is I wish I had more training in it, because I feel like I would do it better justice.
Okay, so another thing that I noticed in my daughter's textbooks and the materials that she gets is there's an awful lot of attention paid to the American pacifist and socialist movement, which I don't have a problem with, except that they ended up being, by the early parts of 1917, a very small number of people. So this question came up in an exhibit, a wonderful exhibit that is coming to New York City if you get to see it. The Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts has a wonderful exhibit of American art of the First World War. And they wanted to have about half of the exhibit be from anti-war voices. And as one of the advisors on that project, I advised them not to do that, because anti-war pacifist voices were not one half of the American people in early 1917. So my question to all of you, in teaching this, how important do you think it is to look at these voices that are clearly important, but at the same time do not represent a large number of people? And you can pick any group that you want. I pick pacifists, but any group that is small, but yet you think is important to include in the story. Is there a group for you? And yes.
Just a quick answer to that. I think what's very important about that time is to see how they were silenced, and how people like a presidential candidate like Eugene Debs is sent to prison. That, to me, is the real fascinating part of that, and that's what also makes it relevant do we still silence those voices? Are they allowed to be heard? Or could we do it again?
I'll just make one really brief comment. Certainly, attention and coverage should be given to those who dissented from the war, but you can also learn a lot by reading the accounts of those who were at the front fighting and what they thought of pacifists and anti-war demonstrators, and it can help give a pretty important lesson about kind of moving against the grain, so to speak, and what it meant both to be separate, to be different, and to be opposed by society, but also to be one of those who felt like they were being betrayed by this very concept. Again, showing different perspectives. The one other underrepresented group that I would say among all the others, from African Americans to women to minorities and all the rest, are all very important, but the European perspective, what did the French and the British think of us when we came over there? And there's actually quite a lot that you can learn from that. They weren't necessarily always happy that we were over there.
Well, if it's okay with our host, I think I'll open it up to the floor, since I know we have to be out of this beautiful room in about 10 minutes or so. So questions from the floor. If not, I do have others. Sir.
Sometimes I think there's a consensus that high school students are incapable of reading books by historians. Would you comment?
Sometimes I'm incapable of reading books by historians.
Yeah, part of that is the historian's fault. Historians often, I hate to say this, have little conception of the public that they're writing for. They tend to write for other academics rather than for other people. So you have to select really carefully, and you have to, there again is where finding primary sources, poetry and fiction and other literature, can be really important. And then you often have to take what the historians have written and translate it into what normal people say, because we're not normal.
I would just say that it's not true. I think students can read books by historians, but I think they need to be given the proper supports to do it. So I think they need to have context. They need to be helped through difficult concepts. So there has to be careful attention paid to helping students process ideas that they probably haven't been exposed to at such a high level. So I read works of nonfiction with students all the time in excerpts and chapters and pieces, and given the correct supports, they absolutely can. But I think sometimes we expect that students can just read something, we assign it, then when they don't understand it, we bemoan it and explain it to them, instead of really helping them through the process of learning how to be good readers, which they clearly need for college and will learn the hard way if they show up without that support. So I think it really is a responsibility of us, for us as high school teachers, to help students become curious, help students become skilled, and help students figure out what to do when they reach a point where they actually don't understand something. How do they work their way through that instead of just giving up?
Yeah, I would agree with what everyone said. I do use secondary sources aside from the textbook. I have a couple readers that I pull them from, and also like History Today, other journals, and many historians write for popular publications also. So I think it's important to try. I try to select articles or shorter excerpts written by historians, and I think World War I, there's a lot of great historical debate and opportunity to think about historiography and how interpretations of it have changed over time. I do like an introductory activity about the causes of World War I, and there's some CNN article or something like 10 historians debate the causes of World War I, and they're short, but like there are 10 different opinions about, or interpretations, I should say, about the causes. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to insert that in. I haven't ever ventured an entire book, but I do use a lot of articles and excerpts from things.
Sir.
Thank you. I had a question about a point of history more than pedagogy, which is my colleague and I use standard texts which emphasize the importance of the Zimmerman telegram. And I'm wondering whether you all think of the Zimmerman telegram as a piece of yellow journalism that was emphasized as sort of an excuse to get into the war, or was it in fact something that really drove American policy to get America into World War I?
The latter. There's no question the Zimmerman telegram was real. There's no question the Germans sent it. They admitted that they sent it. To me, what's important is that it confirms fears in the American body politic in the latter half of 1916 that there really was a plot to kind of surround us. And the people that didn't believe that or didn't want to believe that are very much on the defensive once the Zimmerman telegram states exactly that there is a global plot. So maybe John can confirm this if I'm wrong, but Theodore Roosevelt is supposed to have said when he saw the Zimmerman telegram, if Wilson doesn't declare war now, I will go to the White House and skin him alive. So I'll leave it.
There's a book, just make this note, came out a few years ago that's excellent on the Zimmerman telegram. It's by a gentleman named Thomas Bogart. That's spelled B-O-G-H-A-R-T or D-T. Some DT, yeah, thank you. It's called the Zimmerman telegram, and it really gets in depth in understanding what the telegram meant, where it came from, how it influenced the government, and also popular opinion.
I'll just add while you're getting to the next person that one of the great things about the Zimmerman telegram, and this is where you can use good old-fashioned intrigue to kind of get your students interested. The Germans used our own telegraph system essentially to send it through to Mexico, and the British were intercepting it. They didn't want us to know that they were reading our mail, so they had to come up with a whole plot how they came across it. They also thought the Americans wouldn't believe it. Wilson accepted it almost right away, which was unusual in some ways. But there's a lot of subterfuge and intrigue behind how it was sent, how it was received, how it was released, and so forth that makes it even more interesting.
Can you talk a little bit about the ways in which you show the connection between World War I and World War II? I started teaching World War I because I didn't want to teach it the way I didn't want to teach World War II the way I was taught it, which was very bracketed and very much like this insanity occurred. So if you could talk a little bit about the intervening years and how you draw those connections.
Sure, I can say something, and I'm sure you do the same, Clara. A couple of things. The reason why I emphasize the immediate causes of the war, the immediate context, is I think when we look at the post-war period and we look at some of the problems that the United States is facing in their international relations with Europe, it becomes much easier for students to name why those things are happening. So, for example, when they look at the Treaty of Versailles, first of all, they have a better understanding of why those punishments are put in place based on the causes of the war and also the calamity of the war, but they also can sort of name a connection, and they can also, I think, name a connection between some of the economic decisions that are made in the 20s and in the 30s in Europe by understanding some of the pieces that are behind that. So just a couple of strategies that I use. I continually have students write about, as new events come up, I ask them to draw connections back to World War I, and so using things like webs or other graphic organizers that help students take a new event and see how it connects back to World War I. And then I do have them write. One of the follow-up questions had asked about whether we have people write about World War I. I tend to have people write about World War I after I teach World War I and I start teaching World War II, because there's some very creative and interesting and accurate connections that students can draw between what's happening in World War II. And so really stopping to pause as we look at things like why from the very beginning of the war is FDR making these major attempts to have these relations with Churchill and these meetings and these conferences. To me, there's a connection there. It's not the only reason, but there's a connection to what happens, prior to World War I and during World War I. Why are they planning for the end of the war at the beginning of the war? And so really just stopping and asking students to connect and making overt connections and not waiting until I get through with World War II to then say, okay, compare them. So all along the way, making these points and saying, how does this connect back to World War I is the way that I do it.
And again, I have a little more time in my AP European history class. It's 2 weeks that I spent on World War I, if that sounds like time, I don't know. But I have developed over the years a simulation of the Paris Peace Conference. It started out pretty simple, and now it's gotten way more complex and elaborate. Like I used to do it just with a delegation for the United States, Italy, Britain, France, and I have a German delegation, even though they weren't actually there, but I think that's very important so that they can make their case and react to things and feel that they're not, getting treated well. So that's been really important. I've added to that, and now I have I don't know how many delegations I have. In addition to those, I have also the Polish delegation, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Romanians, the Yugoslavs, Greeks, Irish, Turks, Arabs, Jews, Japan, China. So I keep adding more to it. So I have students sort of representing the different various ethnic, nationality groups in Europe. I've added sort of the Asian delegations, Middle Eastern delegations. So it's far more complex now. It doesn't have to be that complicated. But I find that it's really useful. They prepare for it, a day or two, and we do it over 2 days. And then we debrief it, and we talk about how it compared. They get to vote on issues, and then how that compares to what the actual agreements were. They see that self-determination was not equally applied. They see sort of the issues around Germany, and even how allies like Italy came away dissatisfied. So when we get into the interwar period, I constantly can refer back to that. Remember how when we created Poland, there was this German minority in there, So it allows them kind of an experience to refer back to, and they get into their, positions. That's and I think you can do a simplified version of it also. It doesn't have to be that complicated. So that's the one thing I do that I think is sort of concrete. The other thing is I also just thinking through, I try to also remind students World War I wasn't the only factor. If you look at the rise of fascism, the Nazi Party, it's not until after the Great Depression or during the Great Depression that they really, even though they're making this case about the armistice and all that stuff. So I think that's also important to mention.
Anyone else? Going once? Sir. The question was, to what extent do you deal with British control of transatlantic communications and censorship of the media and shaping American attitudes?
Certainly the British had a disproportionate impact on American opinion, and I don't think there's anything wrong with emphasizing that as one aspect of how American public opinion was shaped. However, there was also a very strong pro-German lobby in the United States, particularly in places like Wisconsin, where my family came from, were Germans from southeast Pennsylvania. But one other side of that, I'd just say very briefly, is that there's been a tendency for a long time to assume that all of the Allied propaganda that we got about the German invasion of Belgium and so on and so forth was false, and that somehow all of the stories of German atrocities and everything else was made up by the British. Certainly much was exaggerated, but that it was made up, and that if the truth were to be told, we'd see there's actually nothing to choose between one side or the other. Scholarship has proven over the last 10 to 15 years conclusively that German atrocities were very widespread. And even I was in Germany just a couple of years ago at the German Military Museum in Dresden, also their museums in Berlin, and they themselves point out in quite great detail that German atrocities against civilians were profound and widespread. So it wasn't just a mythology that was created, but it was also partly a direct result of German actions in Europe.
Well, I guess it falls to me to thank Senator Birmingham, thank the Pioneer Institute, thank our panelists for a great discussion, thank all of you for your great questions. And I don't know where Jamie went, if I'm supposed to turn it to him or turn it back to you, sir.
Thank you all for your attendance, your attention, and your participation. The very last phase of this event is that 5 of our presenters will be signing their books. I assume up here, is that? Oh, in the lobby. Okay, the 5 presenters will be signing their books in the lobby. John Milton Cooper will be signing his book, Woodrow Wilson, A Biography. David Kennedy will be signing his book, Over Here, The First World War in American Society. Edward Langell will be signing To Conquer Hell, The Meuse Are Gone, 1918. Michael Nyberg will be signing The Path to War, How the First World War Created Modern America. And Andrew Carroll will be signing his book, My Fellow Soldiers, General John Pershing and the Americans Who Helped Win the Great War. Thank you once again for your attention.